Welcome to January 2025 with the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm Ann Lloyd, and I'm delighted to have you with us. Hope your new year is off to a great start. We have lots of wonderful things ahead, so sit back and enjoy. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm Ann Lloyd, and I am thrilled to be here with Adrian Tinniswood to talk about his work overall and kind of zoom in on his latest book, The Power and the Glory. And we're going to be focusing on that. But first, I want to welcome you. Welcome, Adrian, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
It's lovely to be with you, Ann. Thank you for asking me. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I am excited to talk. And before we jump into your new book, I must admit, I first became acquainted with your work. I'm turning around if you're listening, but Behind the Throne, which I just fell in love with. It's such a wonderful book. In fact, I got it both in, and I took out all my tabs. I had sticky notes everywhere. They were just a bit distracting. But I want to read you this description of it. If you don't have this, this is a fabulous peek into what happens sort of behind the throne, behind the scenes. It's fabulous, but I love this. Both fun and scholarly, this is a backstage, backstairs, and sometimes back history of England that focuses on the seamy side of power, the sights you weren't intended to see, and the stories you weren't intended to hear. So I love this book, and I thank you for that. But let me ask you, what sort of inspired you to go and look sort of at the backside of history, behind the throne? And then we'll talk about the new book in just a moment. But what inspired you to take a look in that direction?
That's an interesting one, Caroline. I mean, it's people that interest me. I mean, most of my books have been about architecture, and I firmly believe that architecture's got a lot more to do with people than it has to do with stone and bricks and concrete. And I was interested in the royal palaces, in Buckingham Palace, and in Balmoral and Sandringham and Osborne, the great private houses belonging to the throne. And I just kind of wondered how they worked, exactly how they work, because you've got, Queen Elizabeth I had something like 2,000 people in her household. Queen Elizabeth II had 1,200 or so. I mean, these are enormous enterprises, and I just wondered how they were organised. And also, I've got to tell you, Caroline, I am a sucker for gossip. Any kind of gossip I can find, I love it. I just love it. So, Behind the Throne was a way of just kind of teasing out some of the gossip and also trying to see how this vast structure worked, and sometimes didn't work, of course.
Well, and sometimes, honestly, the didn't work stories are the most
Much more fun.
I love that. And I love the idea. So everyone just imagine for a moment, with everything you've heard about Elizabeth I or Queen Victoria or any of those, right to Elizabeth II and the current monarch, King Charles III. Think about what the scurrying that's going on behind the scenes that we are not supposed to see. And then imagine if you could take a peek, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and these places, Buckingham Palace, it is like a vast hotel, and it's got the same kind of arrangements as a hotel, except it's got this kind of superstructure, if you like, of inherited practices, sort of age-old practices. I'll tell you one thing that I'm still not quite sure how this happened. When I started the book, I wasn't that worried about the royals. I wasn't anti-royal, but I wasn't pro-royal. By the time I finished the book, I had nothing but admiration for them. Nothing but admiration for just how they do it. It's incredible.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay. So we've seen the royals, and now we're going to shift just a little from some of the royal houses to sort of royal adjacent in some cases, although they're not the palaces, but certainly
very adjacent in some cases.
Right. So hang on one sec. Just grabbed it from my shelf. So here we have The Power and the Glory. And this is going to take us behind the scenes in a different way to some of these amazing mansions. So they're not palaces, but palace adjacent. That's sort of a
Yeah.
fair phrase.
Yeah.
So I want to start by asking, and it's sort of a funny question for this podcast because many people I have on the podcast, historians, and certainly me, Anne Boleyn tends to be our gateway drug into history and royal history. So I discovered from you that Anne Boleyn was a bit of a gateway drug for Andrew Carnegie as well. So, we have the stories of ghosts in some of these houses. So tell us a little bit about the quest for the ghost or the spirit of Anne Boleyn in Andrew
Well,
Carnegie's quest.
I mean, I think the big quester after Anne Boleyn was one of your countrymen. It was William Waldorf Astor, who bought Hever Castle, the Boleyn family home, and not just because of the Anne Boleyn associations, but certainly that was a really big deal for him. He came over to Britain looking for history, looking for. I mean, he was not the most tactful of men. After sort of saying some very rude things about Americans and being an American himself, he was sort of mildly surprised when New York took against him, which he really shouldn't have been. He should have known better. So he came over and became an adopted Englishman, and he bought a number of country houses. I mean, he bought Cliveden, which is the great country house. Now that's nearly a palace outside London, and which of course is famous. More famous with Brits anyway for Nancy Astor. It was Nancy Astor's family home in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. But he bought Cliveden, and then Hever Castle, this kind of the Boleyn ancestral seat, came on the market. Well, it kind of came on the market. Astor was rich enough; he didn't have to wait for things to come on the market. He could just buy them, and he fell in love with the place completely. He wrote stories. And he really wasn't a very good writer. Not at all. There are these wonderfully kind of fake, antique historical romances about Cliveden and then about Hever and about Anne Boleyn walking the battlements. He's a hopeless romantic. I mean, he may not have been a royal and he may not have been a rebel, but he was certainly a romantic. And Hever was Anne Boleyn walking headless or otherwise. Edwardian ghost, turn of the century. My book's about the turn of the century, 19th, 20th century, basically. And there's a lot about country house ghosts there. It's almost as faith was declining in Britain, more people wanted to believe in ghosts. They wanted confirmation that there was something after death, and the country house was a perfect setting for it. So there are lots of great ghosts I came across, but one of my favourites was a house called Burton Agnes Hall in the north of England, and the story there was that three sisters used to live in it. And the younger sister, for what reason I can't imagine, said that if she died before them, she wanted them to put her head on the hall table. I mean, why? Why would you do that? But she said that, bury my body in the churchyard, but the head, I wanted to sit on the table in the hall. They, of course, ignored her. She died. Then they ignored her again. They buried her. And the next night, they came downstairs and there was the head on the table in the hall. And I mean, I can only imagine what a shock this must have been to them. Anyway, they scooped up the head. They had the body exhumed. They found the head was missing. They popped the head back on, popped the coffin back in, covered it over. Next night, the head was there again. Oh. And now I'd like to say there's an exciting end to this story. There isn't really. It just kind of peters out. It's not quite clear whether they just got fed up with taking the head and putting it back in the coffin or whether they popped it in a box. But I mean, it must have been a bit of a shock to visitors, to stroll into this wonderful Jacobean mansion and find a head on the hall table. Not for me at all.
No. That's an interesting way to experience Britain and these country homes, right? So ghost stories were prevalent in a lot of these homes.
Very definitely. But I mean, there's a great one which your viewers should read if they don't know, by Oscar Wilde, called The Canterville Ghost. And that's the story of Sir Simon de Canterville, an ancient ghost who populates, who wanders round the corridors and bedchambers and galleries of this old country house, Canterville Chase. And the house is rented by an American couple and their two kids. And they're not having any of it. So was it Hiram Otis, the head of the family, for a start, he tries to persuade the Canterville ghost to take some lubricating oil because his chains are rattling so much, and maybe they could just kind of quieten down a bit. Then the kids scare him half to death. And the ghost is so frightened by these children that he goes and hides under his bedclothes for a week and won't come out. So there are all, it's not all serious by a long way, but there is a serious side to it, that there is this need to believe in ghosts, I think. And also it's happening at a time around the turn of the 19th, 20th century when country houses are starting to represent something more. They represent a past which is disappearing. They represent a rural society which is disappearing in this country. As we move, Britain moves to a more, or England, anyway, moves to a more urbanized society. And there's this sense of, the country house representing an Eden that we've lost, a paradise that we've been cast out of. And the ghosts are a part of that somehow. They kind of legitimize that past, and they're a part of that past, and they remind us that that past was once important, even though they're mythic and they're make-believe. And I'm not a believer in ghosts at all, and except on on a dark and stormy night when I'm on my own, then it's kind of harder to not believe, isn't it?
Right, absolutely. So part of the appeal then of these homes and these ghost stories is the past that they represent.
Yeah, very much.
Do you think that's part of what made them appealing to Americans? Because Americans tend to be buying some of these homes. So talk to us a little bit about the American connection. You've mentioned Astor and Hever and some of these other places, but
sure. I mean, one of the most important and most famous, I think, is Andrew Carnegie, who you mentioned in passing earlier on. Mm-hmm. Andrew Carnegie and his wife Louise. He's Scottish born, but of course he goes over to Pittsburgh. He makes a fortune, doesn't he, in steel and other things, and then they start spending their summers back in the Scottish Highlands, the land of his birth, if you like, and eventually. He and Louise buy this castle, Skibboo Castle in the Scottish Highlands, and they transform it into a palace of a place. It's not called a palace, but it's still pretty darn big, and they live there very happily. Although there's one occasion I know which your viewers might find entertaining. And I think in 1902, Edward VII suddenly announced he was going to pay a visit to Andrew Carnegie at Skibboo, and they gave him like an hour's notice, for a royal visit. Everybody freaked completely. Everybody's running, because normally you've got weeks and weeks. It's just that Edward VII happened to be staying in the neighbourhood, and he'd heard about Skibboo Castle. And being a king, you could do that. You just sat, I'm coming to see. Don't say you're out because I'm coming anyway, kind of thing. And it caused a complete panic. But eventually, they got the place straight. Edward VII was shown into the library, I think it was, at Skibboo. And for some reason that honestly escapes me, Andrew Carnegie recited a poem to the king, which was by a guy called Joachim Miller, who was an absolute fervid anti-Brit. He hated the Brits. Ooh. And this poem has a line in it which starts something like, "Hail to thee, fat Edward." At which point Andrew Carnegie stops and says to the king, "That's you, sire." It didn't go down. The king, Edward VII, was really sensitive about his weight. His nickname was Tum Tum, but nobody called him that to his face. The day was saved, though, when Andrew and Louise Carnegie's little girl, 5-year-old daughter, Margaret, stomped up to the king, holding a rose in her hand, shoved it into his face and said, "This is for you." And he was so charmed that he couldn't be angry anymore.
Well, children will do that, right?
Exactly, yeah. They either save the day or they wreck it, one or the other. There's no middle way.
Well, but that gives us just a hint or a peek that there were children there as well. We often think with these really wealthy owners, we think of the adults not the children, but these were families at the time living in these homes.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, you've got to, it depends how many there are, and it depends how old they are, and it depends, what gender they are. But typically, the boys go to school, either to prep school, but certainly go away to school by the time they're 10 or 11, if they've not gone earlier to boarding school. The girls still tend to be educated at home, but there's, I mean, a governess and a nanny and a schoolroom maid, a nursery maid, undermaids. That's a separate department. That's part of the country house, and that's a really important part of it too. Typically, and although it does vary a bit, but typically the parents don't have too much to do with the upbringing of the kids. There is this. It's almost a cliche now that small children don't meet their parents except at afternoon tea, when nanny will bring them down, make sure they're bathed and dressed and they look smart, bring them down to say hi to mum and dad, and then they're taken off back up to the nursery. So it's quite a remote sort of upbringing. And of course, when the boys then are packed off to boarding school, and they could go as early as 7 or 8 as well. I mean, it's not wasn't good for them at all. But it was it was part of life. It's what you did. It's what you had done as a father, or you had done as a mother. And that was just what was expected. It would be very odd to form a close emotional bond with. Actually, that's not true, because you did form a close emotional bond with your kids, and you see that, I think, in the First War, when so many sons, almost all sons, but sons and brothers died. And, you've got mothers who are distraught and who never, ever get over it. Over and over again. There's a country house. Now, you got to stop me if I'm rambling on, because you can tell I just will. I just will. There's a country house, one of my favourite country houses in Britain. It's called Castle Drogo. And it was built by the architect Edwin Lutyens. It was built for a grocer, a department store owner called Julius Drew. And it was started in 1910. And then when the European War broke out in 1914, everything stopped. The family was still living in another house. They were living miles away at a place called Wadhurst, and the house wasn't finished. In 1917, their son, Adrian Drew, was killed in the First War. He was killed in Flanders. And what they did was what a lot of families did then. They turned his bedroom into a kind of a shrine, a memorial room, they called it. So there's his school photographs. There's all, there's his cricket bat, there's his blazer, there's just mementos of his life. And they did that at Wadhurst. What interests me is that Castle Drogo, the house that was being built for them, it wasn't finished till 1928. They couldn't move into it till 1928, 11 years later. When they moved into it, they took this memorial room, lock, stock and barrel, from the old house and reinstalled it in the brand new house. They couldn't leave Adrian Drew behind. I mean, that's just a mark, I think, of what this is, well over a decade after his death, how important it was.
Yes, and that tells us something about how life is changing with the war and with all that loss, and these homes sort of change too. Bits are taken away, and we do hear of that happening at the turn of the century, as some households are broken up and some homes are broken up. So let's talk about some of the homes and the craftsmen and the engineers and everything that went into the creation and upkeep of these homes, because we forget just how large and how much changes as electricity is introduced and all these kinds of things.
It's a very good point. That one of the things when I was researching the book, one of the things that really surprised me, maybe it shouldn't have, is the amount of new technology and the effect that new technology had on the country house. I mean, you think in between 1880 and 1910, so say 30 years, you've got electric light becomes normal. You've got the motor car. By Edward VII is the first member of the royal family to drive a car, to own a motor car, which revolutionises country house life. You can come for the weekend. You could come for the weekend by rail. Initially, rail, the train revolutionised country house life and created the country house weekend. The Saturday to Monday, as it's called. But then the car means that you can come and go a lot more easily. So you've got, you've got gas lighting, you've got telephones. New technology makes a huge difference. I mentioned the book just as an example. There's a country house again in Scotland, Dunravel Lodge, which belonged to the Duke of Hamilton, I think, if I remember right. And there was a big article in Country Life magazine, I think, describing the new laundry that the Duke of Hamilton had got, and you think, well, laundry, is that big a deal? It's it's a steam laundry and one thing another. Then you read at the bottom of the article that this made a big difference to life at the house, because every week they had to wash 1,800 pieces of linen. Bed linen, shirts, 1,800. I mean, my heart sinks when I put a couple of loads in the washing machine. 1,800 pieces, though. Goodness
Mm-hmm.
me.
Mm-hmm.
Very labor intensive. And even it's interesting that even when technology is available, some of the older families are reluctant to use it, new technology or labor saving devices. And that's because they've got the best labor saving device of all. They've got servants. Why should we bother? Why install hot and cold running water when we pay the undermaid to cart it up and downstairs anyway? That's her job. Why get an you get electric toasters, but why get an electric toaster? Because we've got the kitchen maid to make the toast. So there's that kind of there's a reluctance among some of them, and the traditional view is that the families that really adopt new technologies are the nouveau riche industrialists, because they've seen what new technologies will do in their factories in the city. And when they buy their big country house, when they've got, they've got their pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, when they buy their country house, they know what technology can do. And they're the ones who really kind of move it along.
Well, that's interesting because when you think about technology and the servants or the staff, how does it affect the staff? Do you still need a kitchen maid dedicated to toast when you have an electric toaster? So it affects the sort of below stairs as well as upstairs.
It does. But in a way, I think it's the other way round, that you start to see, even round about early 1900, you start to see a slowdown in the servant market, if you like. In 1901, indoor domestic servants form the biggest occupational group in Britain. There are more servants than anything else, and the vast majority are women. The vast majority, I think there are 50,000 indoor male servants. The rest of that 1.1 million are women. But as women become more reluctant to go into service, and it's only ever, for most of them, it's not a career. Most women go into service when they leave school at 14, they marry at 25 or 26, quite late, quite late, and they come out of service because you don't have married servants. So it's just a job you do between school and finding Mr. Right. So it's a kind of a transient, and indeed a lot of servants, they move on. We've got this kind of almost this Downton Abbey notion of these faithful retainers. I think somebody did some work years ago suggesting that they looked at women servants in the 1870s or 1880s, and the average stay in a household is 2 years. They move on. They look for better jobs. They look for more money. But as what they called the servant problem starts to bite, as women become more reluctant to go into service, because it's a 6.5 day a week job, it's demeaning, you've got to wear a uniform, you've got to tug your forelock, you're constantly being told what to do. Whereas if you work in an office or a factory, it's still hard, but it's maybe 6 days a week, and you go home at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. You've got a life. Now, as the servants start to retreat from British homes, labour-saving devices become a lot more important. Because if you've not got a maid to make the toast, you want something that's going to be easy to do it. And you see that even more in the 1920s and 30s, I think. After the First War, when so many women have gone into war work in factories, they are reluctant to go back into service. Now, that said, the country house is probably the last place to lose its servants, because a job in a country house, with a titled couple, the Downton Abbey thing, is the kind of job you want if you're a servant. You're working with, well, I think Nancy Astor at Cliveden had 28 indoor servants in the 1920s and 30s, and that meant that the lines of demarcation are carefully drawn. You've got everybody has their own job, their own responsibilities. Whereas if you're a 14-year-old kid working in a single, you're the only servant in a greengrocer's, and his wife's suburban villa. You have to do it all. You've got to do the food prep. You've got to do the cleaning. You've got to make the beds. You've got to clear out the grates. You're doing everything. In a country house, different people do different things. You've got a lamp boy who trims all the lamps. You've got at Chatsworth they had at least 7 housemaids. So work wasn't too hard for them. It was still a job that people wanted to do for a long time, right through into the 1940s, I think, 30s and 40s.
So how would you, as a young woman, for example, just left school, how would you get a job in a country home versus having to take the greengrocer and his wife? How do they find those
Yeah,
right fits?
that's a really good question. Now, what you do have are servant registries, and they're basically employment agencies for servants. So you can go there with a reference from the local Sunday school teacher or something like that. And you also look at the advertisements in those servant registries. Mrs. Massey's was one of the big ones, but there are half a dozen or more of them. And if you're looking for better work, you keep an eye on things. It's I mean, this is a generalization, but by and large, country house owners were slightly reluctant to take girls from the neighborhood because they had family and friends in the neighborhood. So when they got their half day off on Sunday afternoon, they went home and gossiped about what was going on in the big house. And you didn't want that. So it's not a hard and fast rule by any means, but it was generally, you look further afield for your servants. And of course, in big houses, the really powerful country houses, you might have a French or a Belgian chef, male chef, your lady's maid who help you dress every morning. She might be French or Swiss. So you've got sort of foreign servants as well, who are again, they have quite a tight bond with their mistress or their master, and they're actually disliked by the other servants because it's suspected that they report what goes on in the servants' hall back to the valet and the lady's maid report to their master or their mistress what's going on. So they're never quite kind of one of us, if you know what I mean.
Those lines blur a little bit between upstairs and downstairs.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And that is often played up in some of and I'm going to ask a little bit about some of the television representations. And now we have movies of Downton Abbey as well. But, as I was growing up, it was upstairs, downstairs that sort of addressed this Edwardian.
Yeah. Wonderful.
So I feel like people were so drawn to these shows. Even today, what is it that's so fascinating about this way of life or about these magnificent homes? That's
a hard question to answer. I mean, I think a love affair with the past is something, it's been an ongoing love affair with the past. And it's not just us. Country Life magazine was founded in 1897. And it started a series which is still going today of country homes and gardens. Every week there would be an article on an historic country house. The very first one was Baddesley Clinton in Warwickshire. Beautiful moated manor house. It was so gorgeous, but also so romantic. It's mythic. There's nothing about how it was built in those articles or the sort of decorative schemes. It's all about, imagine mailed knights in armor and damsels in distress sort of, sailing in a barge on the moat kind of thing. It's that sort of heavily romanticized view of the past, which, when I was a lad, I used to laugh at that. Now I actually quite like the idea. What's the harm? What's the harm in dreaming? It might not be true, but
it's a good story.
Exactly, and never let the truth get in the way of a good story, Caroline.
Right.
Don't tell anyone I said that.
No, all truth here. So talking about some blurred lines, I want to follow up on something kind of fun we've just alluded to, but I just want to address it, which is we have some burlesque dancers or
Um,
music
uh,
hall artistes, who are coming into these homes, and talk a little bit about what happens when
yeah,
sort of the others come into these homes, and there are some crossed lines in some cases.
yeah. No, it's an intriguing answer to that. I think. I mean, I'll give you an example. One of my favorite characters in my book. In fact, I'm more than a little in love with her. Is a woman called Belle Bilson. Belle was a music hall artist. She was a burlesque artist. She and her sister Flo were on the music halls as Flo and Belle. They did a double act. When the fourth Earl of Clancarty, who owned a vast estate in Ireland and was a minor courtier. He and his wife were at all the kind of Buckingham Palace levees and balls and things. When he opened his paper one morning and found out that his son, Viscount Dunlow, had got married without telling him, he had his nose put out of joint a bit. When he then discovered that Viscount Dunlow had married Belle Bilson, a musical artiste, he went apoplectic. And when he found out that Belle already had a child, an illegitimate child, she was older than Viscount Dunlow, and the father of her child was doing 18 months in Pentonville jail for fraud, he wasn't pleased. He was not pleased at all. And he did his level best to break up the marriage. Even hiring private detectives to find out if Belle was committing adultery, was having affairs. She wasn't. They invented the evidence, and it was discredited in court. And she was found. That Clancarty persuaded his son, who was useless. He was brainless. Apparently, he won Belle in a wager at a race course. There's romance for you, isn't it? But all that said, he sued her for divorce on grounds of adultery. That failed. And then when this had all got blown over, so the 1880s, Belle and the useless Viscount Dunlow, the useless husband, they seem to fall back in love properly. And Belle becomes Viscountess Dunlow. Then she becomes the Countess Clancarty. There's a wonderful photograph of her somewhere of her in her coronation robes at Edward the Seventh's coronation. And she just fitted in to landed society. She wasn't supposed to. That's not how it's supposed to happen. And she did all the right things. She went sick visiting on the estate. She was in the local Sunday school. She attended charity events, and everybody loved her. And she just became the perfect nobleman's wife. And as I say, that's not how it's supposed to work. And quite often it didn't, of course. I mean, she's a bit of an exception. What tended to happen is that irate fathers would pay. The music hall artiste would sue for breach of promise when the son and heir had his second thoughts about marrying, and would make a lot of money. I mean, I think one case, I can't remember now, but it's something like £50,000, which was a massive fortune in 1900. I mean, a colossal amount. And that was more frequent, not the £50,000, but the suing for breach of promise thing. It was Belle was the exception, but she is lovely. She was lovely.
Well, that's nice to hear that they fell back in love and made good on it.
I know.
So, in addition to these kinds of events going on, and we know about some of the activities, like some of the balls or the shootings, not of each other, the shooting parties.
Although that happened too.
So we'll hold the shooting each other's, because I do want to get to that. But talk to us about some of the activities, like the balls or the shooting parties. Foxes, I believe, were the typical, or I guess birds as well. But...
For a hunt, yes. I mean, shooting became really important around about the 1880s, 1890s as a country house pastime. I mean, people bought shooting estates. They bought a country house just for the shooting, for pheasant or grouse or whatever. And partly that's down to improvements in gun technology, if you like. When you've got a barrel-loaded musket, it takes forever to prime it and do everything. Then you shoot it, it normally just about knocks you over. You're enveloped in a cloud of black smoke. You can't see a bird if you've shot at it, and if the odds are you've missed it anyway. But with breech loading shotguns and choke bore the choke bore muzzles, which increase the velocity of the shot, and cartridges which contain powder and shot and everything. It becomes a lot easier to kill things,
Mm,
put it bluntly.
mhm.
And you'll see that, the shoot Edward the Seventh, as Prince of Wales and as king, was routinely shot on his Sandringham estate and on many of the other estates that he visited. His son, George V was obsessed with shooting. He famously, when his wife sent him, he was staying at a country house for the shooting, and his wife sent a telegram up saying that her mother had just died, and she was heartbroken, and would he come home? And he was heard as he got into the car saying, "That's done it. That's ruined my shooting for the week, hasn't it?" Awful, awful.
Oh,
What those,
priorities.
yeah, what those improvements in gun technology meant was a massive slaughter. I mean, George V and his son, the Prince of Wales, who would become Edward VIII. They at Hall Barn in whatever it was, 1912, 1913, I can't recall. They shot something like 3 or 4 thousand birds in a day.
Oh,
I mean, it was still a record that it was just, but that's not sport. That's not. And the King George said to his son, "I think we might have overdone it today." Well, too right, mate.
yeah, yeah, bit much. But it is interesting. It sort of reminds me of when, in Tudor times, Henry VIII would at Hampton Court, not with shotguns, but with, I guess, arrows, go hunting and spend that's sort of a pastime of the rich and famous that just has
Yeah,
other iterations through time.
yeah. That's a really interesting point. Yeah.
So, but speaking of shooting, and you did mention they do shoot each other. There are some mysteries and crimes at some of these country houses, and that's quite exciting. So, tell us a little bit about. We've heard a little bit about the ghost, but tell us about some of the crimes at the
Yeah, I mean,
Edwardian.
country house crime seemed to have been quite a big. I mean, everybody just always assumed it was the servants that did it, but you'll get petty pilfering, you'll get sort of burglars, you'll get a housekeeper that leaves a window open for the burglars to come in at night. You'll get a disgruntled butler who steals all the family silver and sort of makes a run for it across the park. And you occasionally get much more serious crimes. I think is it Gorse Hall where the family there, the owner, was stabbed to death, and they never found out who did it. They never found out who did it. Those kinds of crime. I mean, I suppose in a sense they're reflecting crime in the wider society. And there is a sense I think in which the country house, rarefied though it is a mirror held up to society, with those sort of strict graduations, that kind of hierarchy that you've got, the upstairs downstairs split, that kind of social apartheid between the two communities. But yeah, I mean, it could get quite nasty. There was one case where, and I can't remember the name of the house now, where I think the footman invited the butler down into the butler's pantry, and for no obvious reason, when they were both there, he whipped out a gun and shot him, and then shot himself. The footman survived, the butler survived, but it's these kinds of, I suppose, these kind of tensions in a very tight community. Small things in that enclosed community when you're all living on top of each other. Small things get to be big things, and then those big things find an outlet, which is sometimes violence.
Right. And it just seems a very tempting. I know when we look at crime stories like Agatha Christie, they tend to be set often in these kinds of environments where you have everybody in this space isolated kind of thing.
Absolutely. And that's, of course, because the country house is a ready-made closed environment. You've got all and usually, they'll take place in the winter and snow will have cut off so their escape. So you've got you've got the suspects all together.
Mm-hmm.
And the country house is, there's a whole kind of genre of country house detective fiction. Niall Marsh's first book, A Man Lay Dead, is set in a country house. I don't know if your viewers know Marjorie Allingham's Albert Campion. A lot of those whodunits, from the golden age of detective fiction in the 30s and 40s, they're set in country houses because they are,
Yes.
short of an island, it's the next best, the next best enclosed community.
Right. And often, as you say, with bad weather, then everybody's trapped together.
Yeah.
And so one of us has done it kind of
Yeah.
thing. And so it's like an ideal
and
scenario.
and us- usually, in the chapter one or chapter two, you'll find out that the owner has a rare collection of knives and knives and pistols, and you know what's coming, don't you? You know what's coming by chapter three.
Yes, yes. That's a good point. So you mentioned the rare collections. What kinds of things did some of these owners have? So the house itself, of course, incredibly valuable. But what were the furnishings or the artwork in some of these very stately country homes?
Well, I mean, it depends, which isn't a very helpful answer, is it? But I mean, one of the things that intrigued me again when I was working on the book is the role played by outsiders in
Mm.
late Victorian and Edwardian country house society. And the reason I mentioned that, and we can say more about that, but a good example of that is Ferdinand Rothschild at Waddesdon Manor in
Oh
Buckinghamshire, north of
yeah.
London. And Rothschild was a great collector of 18th century French art and art objects. And so he built a French chateau. He
Mm.
just built a French chateau in the middle of the countryside to house, and even it was after the fall of Paris in 1870, and so Paris was being rebuilt. He sent his agents over to Paris to bring back entire rooms from some of the great townhouses. So you've got paneling and fireplaces that are the real thing. They're not fake, and those they're there as settings for his paintings, for his beautiful furniture. Not everybody liked 18th century French, but it was certainly a fashion, as was medieval, the Gothic.
Mhm.
One of my favourite characters is the Marquis of Bute at Cardiff Castle in Wales. He and his architect William Burgess, who was ever so slightly crazy, but in a good way. They rebuilt the medieval Cardiff Castle, and they built it as a medieval fantasy. Brand new. It wasn't finished until about 1900, when both men were dead, I think. But it was the most extravagant piece of whimsy, if you like. So there are battlements, there are statues of knights in armor and damsels. And it is the only house I know where the duck-billed platypus is used as a decorative motif. You go into the library there, and Burgess was wonderful. He carved duck-billed platy. Oh, they both duck-billed platypi. Do you think? I don't know what is the plural, but let's
I don't
we'll
know. We'll
no,
have to
but
look
no,
that
no.
up.
Let's move on from that one, shall we? Before, but the library's wonderful. It's carved. There's a carved armadillo reading a book with a bookworm in it. There are duck-billed platypi. There are monkeys. Well, Burgess loved monkeys.
Mm.
There's I think it's the Marquis of Bute's dining room at Cardiff Castle. There is it's panelled, and there's a frieze around the kind of dado rail and the panelling, a frieze of carved monkeys. And one of these monkeys has ivory teeth and a little nut in its mouth. And that's how the Marquis of Bute summoned servants. He shoved the nut down the monkey's throat, and that set off the pneumatic bell push system down in the basement. Oh, it's
Oh,
such good fun. You know,
that's fabulous.
it's wonderful. It's pure crazy, and it's a fabulous, fabulous country house. Well, it's in the heart of Cardiff now, but it's a wonderful house.
Well, isn't that amazing to just see these personalities really come through and how they
Yeah,
created, their version of the past in medieval times? That's just marvelous.
yeah.
So, as we come sadly to the end of our conversation, I could go on for hours, but as we come to the end of our conversation, when and you've mentioned all of the research you've done and some
Mm.
things that surprised you, I just wonder, is there anything that really stands out that surprised you? Because these, television programs or these stories or these mysteries set in country houses have sort of conditioned us to have certain expectations of the country
Yeah,
home.
yeah,
What surprised you, and what kind of stuff?
yeah. I mean, the big thing, I've alluded to it already. The big thing was the number of outsiders. People who traditional landed society regarded as outsiders and who weren't. I've mentioned Ferdinand Rothschild and his cousin, in fact, Alfred Rothschild, who had built another French chateau for himself a few miles away. And, not only were they rich, they were Jewish. And Britain was an anti-Semitic society around, in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they gained acceptance from some, but not from others. They're still kind of regarded as not quite one of us. That sort of rather nasty, quiet racism that you got. We've got Americans like Astor and Carnegie coming in. And a little bit later, of course, famously Consuelo Vanderbilt, who marries the Duke of Marlborough rather unhappily. You've got at Elverdon this enormous shooting estate in the east of England. It was remodeled for Duleep Singh, the last Maharaja of the Sikh Empire, who had had his empire taken from him by the British, but was given a pension and a country house. And Elverdon is wonderful. On the outside, it looks like a really ordinary, quite dull, but big Italianate mansion. You walk inside and it drips with Rajput decoration and architecture. It's fabulous. And it was bought when Duleep Singh went bankrupt, in fact. It was bought by Sir Edward Guinness. And again, brewers as outsiders who are accepted in society. A lot of this had to do with Edward VII, who was very happy. He broke down a lot of those social barriers. He had a lot of Jewish friends. He had friends who were bankers and brewers and industrialists. And, traditional British landed society, the dukes and the earls and the barons didn't think they were quite the thing. But they couldn't say much about it if Edward thought he thought they were. It helped, of course. It helped that they were most of Edward VII's friends were very, very rich indeed. And since Edward was always on the scrounge for money, it did help to have very rich friends. But that sense of traditional class barriers or social barriers breaking down around 1900, I think that's the thing that surprised me most of all.
Well, and that's really interesting with the country house. I'm just going to hold it up again so you can all see it.
Oh, thank you.
As one of the ways we understand what's happening in society, and one of the ways it's reflected, both the longing for the past with the ghosts and all of that, but the reality of the present and changes in technology, changes in society, changes in status and stratification of society. And then the war comes in and sort of upends all kinds of things. Yeah. So this is the story of all of that. And it's just been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Lovely to talk to you, Caroline. Thank you.
It's been wonderful. So can you give us a hint of what you might be working on next?
It's a hint. I've got two projects.
All right.
One is a book about the country houses of the Guinness family, the brewers. And they had 10, 12 big country houses. So I'm writing about that. But I think I've got a thing about the Regency. And I promise it's not about Bridgerton, because I've seen 10 minutes of Bridgerton. It's not about Bridgerton, but I just have a thing about Regency Britain at the moment. So I'm just very early stages, but I'm just trying to explore the idea of the Regency country house and what it was like to live in some of the great houses of the early 19th century. So you heard it here first. That's the possible. That's what I hope is going to be the next big project.
That is wonderful. And I hope you will come back and talk to us about that when it's done.
I will be back like a shot. You've made me so welcome. Thank you so much indeed.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I will have all kinds of information about where you can get the book and other things, but it's just fantastic. So I know you'll enjoy it. Thank you again, Adrian, for spending some time with us and taking us into a world that, takes us behind the scenes to see all that happens in those country homes, those famous homes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I appreciate your listening. I would really appreciate it if you'd leave us a rating or share with a friend. It's wonderful to have you part of this journey as we see how history shows us what's possible.